Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, November 14th, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at the state of Indiana. Brand new news out of the Hoosier state showing that Republicans do not have enough votes to move forward with a mid-decade redraw as the White House J.D. Vance visited the state twice to convince them and the Republicans who were holding out on this vote to make the decision to give Republicans an additional seat in the 2026 midterms up in northern parts of Indiana. Indiana's 1st District, currently represented by Frank Mervyn, was the target of the Republican Party's pressure campaign in this state. Donald Trump and the White House went to Republicans all across the state, including the governor, Mike Braun, who previously served as United States Senator from the state of Indiana, came into office in 2018. If you watched my videos back then, you might remember that that was the time that he came about a central figure in American politics. Not central as insofar that, he was known as a senator, one of 100, but now as governor of Indiana, tried to build out an even bigger profile by trying to force the Republicans, who many of them were very clear in their holdout that they would not move forward with a mid-decade redraw. And Indiana making this decision pushes back against what the Republican Party and what the White House, quite frankly, had planned ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. They got through in states like Missouri that now have one less Democratic representative after the next midterm cycle. They got through in a state like North Carolina, where this 1st District with Representative Don Davis has now been drawn into a way that is overwhelmingly in favor of the Republican Party. No chance the Democrats hold on to this one. And they also did it in Texas, where 5 of the state's total Democratic delegates, or representatives rather, have been stripped away of their seats in the coming midterm years. The Republicans were vindictive, but it all comes to a screeching halt, not just in Indiana, but arguably across the country. With new news out of the state of Kansas, too, that they will be also halting their efforts to do a mid-decade redraw come right after California's Proposition 50 passes overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic Party in this state. And looking at what Prop 50 essentially said is that it would counteract what was going to be done in the state of Texas in giving Democrats an additional 5 seats across this Democratic state, giving Democrats the same number that Republicans were taking away in Texas. Rather than go for an additional 6th or 7th seat here, the California Prop 50 map does usher in Democrats at roughly 48 statewide and the Republicans at just 4. Now, looking at Indiana in specific, the idea here again was to draw Frank Mervyn's seat from what was, roughly a very competitive district. Kamala Harris won the district by less than a point in the last election. We can take a look at the recent races here. She won it by 0.4%. It was an exceptionally close race in the congressional district, and, Democrats were certainly not super confident about their chances here should the map undergo a redraw. But even though Kamala Harris won the district by roughly half a point, Frank Mervyn went on to win it by 8.5 points against his Republican challenger. In 2022, it was a competitive race as well. Frank Mervyn won it by 5.7%, but the point was that the numbers of representatives for the Democratic Party had been reduced effectively across the state. Yes, Republicans still held the same number here, but there was certainly a toss-up district in the 5th district here that Democrats were targeting heavily that they believed, could be competitive. In 2018, it was not as competitive. This is interesting, though. I don't know what the lore is there in Indiana's 2nd and 9th to go from being, quite competitive to not. But in Indiana's 5th district, Victoria Spartz went on to defeat Christina Hale by roughly 4.1% in Indiana's 5th. But then, after 2020, the census was redone. This safe district was drawn to be a more competitive one, but it was still one that Democrats were able to win because Frank Mervyn was so popular. And so the Republicans saw him as a threat, not in Indiana necessarily, but on the national level, as Democrats have, just a 3-seat deficit to win to get the majority in 2026. As it stands right now, there could be a feasible pathway to Republicans blocking Democrats in a multitude of ways that would make it that much more difficult for them to win the House majority in 2026. But as is the case in many of these states, the appetite for it is quite diminished. The White House was riding high. After Texas, they went to Missouri and North Carolina, and they were successful. But the first real halt came in the state of Ohio, where they decided to do a redraw in that state because the courts had mandated it. But in the state of Ohio, in terms of what we actually saw, the Republicans were in a bit of a tricky situation. If you don't know the lore about Ohio, I'll explain it simply because it's in the Midwest and so is Indiana, and I think it'd be quite interesting. But the point is here that Republicans and Democrats could not agree on a congressional map. And so the Democratic Party saw that in 2020, when the census was redone, Republicans were trying to draw an excessive gerrymander just as the one had existed in 2016, 2014, and so on and so forth, that had damned Democrats down to just 4 seats statewide. Even in 2012, when they were winning the state statewide, Democrats had just roughly 1 out of the 1 in 4 seats here in the state of Ohio across the board. But after 2020, Republicans tried to be more vindictive, but the courts struck down their map and implemented one that they felt was fairer across the state. And with it, the Democratic Party ended up in a position where the congressional boundaries ended up with Democrats winning roughly 5 of the seats here compared to the Republicans at 10. So this map was meant to be a pretty egregious Republican gerrymander, but it ultimately fell flat on its face here because the Democrats were able to get around it, run strong candidates, have good races. The GOP did not have the best candidates here, but again, this is a map that was only meant to be temporary as the court had mandated. So the court had said, okay, now that, neither party is in agreement on this, you have to go back to the drawing board. This map can only be implemented for 2 election cycles. Now you must do it again. And so what happened there is that the Republicans and Democrats went back to the drawing board. But as is set up by Ohio's Redistricting Commission and what is set as standard by the state's constitution, if Democrats do not vote for the new congressional map, what it will effectively do is render it only permissible for 1 election cycle, meaning that then the courts would have to make a decision of what type of map to implement, which there was a chance that the maps would not have been as favorable to the Republican Party as they would have hoped. So they approached the Democrats with a compromise. They took this district that Democrats won by just a point in the last cycle and turned it into a more conservative district, nearly assuring that Republicans will win it. But Marcy Kaptur is a beast and an electoral juggernaut who might be able to hold on. She announced that she's going to run for re-election. And then this district in specific, Ohio's 13th, actually became more Democratic. So Democrats can pretty routinely rely on about 4 seats in the state of Ohio compared to the map that they were being floated that could have been implemented for just 1 cycle but would inevitably be overdone and redone by the courts that would have given Republicans a 13-2 advantage. And so Ohio did not go for as much as they could have. They reached that compromise. Now the map is going to maintain itself through the end of the decade, and you don't run the risk of going to the courts where you could end up with a less favorable map. It is a compromise, gives Republicans a little something, given that they have the dominating advantage, but also Democrats hold on to something too. But that was the first real blow against the Republican Party and the White House, who wanted Ohio to go for a 13-2 map. Then they went over to Kansas and said, please, please, please redraw Sharice Davids out of this district here. This is a state that is Republican through and through. Granted, Donald Trump still wins the state by about 16 points, but they really wanted Sharice Davids out. And again, it's not as if it's outside the realm of possibility in the right circumstances. Kamala Harris only won the district by roughly 4 points. But Sharice Davids is immensely popular, and they knew without a redraw, they would not get her out. Now, whether it is the fact that, Kansas has some more moderate Republicans who are not fully on board with this, whether it is the fact that Kansas's Supreme Court is controlled entirely by the Democratic Party, as you look to it, the threat here becomes a lot less substantive, largely because there are so many pathways to block the Republicans from moving forward with it, but they did not even try. And so Kansas will not see a new map either, yet again another blow to the Republican Party, nationwide. And so now Indiana, jumping into this is something that we knew a little bit earlier, but Governor Mike Braun had said, Donald Trump and Republicans, please be patient with us as we go to Indianapolis and try to convince these Republicans to switch over, but the Republicans are unwilling. Even the Senate President Pro Temp, who is the leader of the Republicans in the Indiana State Senate, is in personal opposition to it, and likely is providing cover for a lot of the Indiana Republican senators who likewise are in opposition to it. The Republicans actually launched a full-fledged campaign against the Republicans in the state Senate, trying to pressure them to vote for a brand new map here, but the point is that there's no appetite for it, at least not the ones that, we're looking at, this from that perspective of, if we do it, other Democratic states are going to follow through. And so that's really what is going to be interesting about this, is that now that the White House is starting to lose more and more and more states, that whether it is a process of, elimination, with Republicans dropping off of being on board, or it's fear of Democratic retaliation or what voters will do in response, the White House can't stop losing on the battle of redistricting. And now the math for the GOP gets a bit trickier. Because as we see this conversation about where can Republicans go next, California, Texas, Missouri, and North Carolina have all decided to do their redraws. Those are set in stone, besides Missouri, which might get a ballot referendum that might stop it in its tracks, which would be yet again another loss for the GOP that even launched this in the first place. Utah now has a new map. Democrats are near guaranteed to get a pickup there. In Ohio, Republicans at most will get one seat in 2026, and even then, it's not a guarantee. And now Virginia is open to the idea of trying to do redistricting across the state that, if the voters approve it, could net Democrats 2, 3, 4 seats across the state, which would be monumental on the national stage, given that it is the Republican Party that began with this first. And you're already starting to see the Republicans at the White House and in Washington, D.C. are freaking out. You see here that MAGA influencers are calling this a monumental betrayal unfolding in Indiana, calling these Republicans spineless and saying that they're rhinos, that it's wrong in the state of Indiana to not redraw the map. But what we know is that on a partisan level, regardless of how you feel about it, Indiana's maps are already excessively gerrymandered. The only toss-up district is one that Democrats win, and that would reduce them down to just one seat across the state if you were to eliminate it. It would put the Democrats at 1 and the Republicans at 8. In the last presidential election, Kamala Harris got roughly 40% of the vote in the state. Very obviously, the Indiana maps are gerrymandered to a degree that gives Republicans that consistent upper hand no matter what. The smallest margin of any Republican victory across the state is right here in Victoria Sparks' district of 18.6%. But beyond that, the district in itself is very, very solid for the GOP in even more ways when you take a look at how it votes on other levels. Victoria Sparks is actually remarkably unpopular. She only survived her primary with 33% of the vote for re-election in 2024. But again, getting back to this, taking a look at why this is such a damning defeat for the GOP is because it foretells likely more and more failures on their side when it comes down to mid-decade redistricting. When it comes down to trying to change what's happening in Indiana, it's going to fail there, as it has in Kansas, and as it may in Missouri, and as it may all across this country. The Republican Party is running out of states to do redraws in. They are running out of places to go, to beg and plead with the Republicans in control of state legislatures to give them 1 or 2 more seats. And I think the Republican Party, in part, isn't willing to give up all of their moral high ground and their moral basis for the opposition to this simply for 1 or 2 seats to be gained. Because Republicans see those results in November of 2025. They read the same papers we do. Well, maybe not, but they read the same things that we do, that everyone does. That everyone who is interested in politics, sure, there might be a different in consumption, news is what I'm saying, but I do believe they know at its core that the Republican Party is not popular today, and that they are likely to lose the midterms with or without a mid-decade redraw, and 1 more seat is not saving the Republican Party from the impending doom that is about to come on them. That is about to happen across this country as many of these toss-up districts swing overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic Party. And it looks like these Indiana Republicans, and although they may be partisan in a multitude of ways, simply are not going to abide by the White House's pressure tactics to redraw their state's congressional boundaries. And as they announced that there will not be a convening of the Indiana Senate in December, the Republicans are running out of time to find any way to force these redraws across these states. Because as you get to the filing deadlines, it becomes that much more difficult for any of these states to follow through with any of the hypotheticals, Democratic or Republican, any of the hypotheticals that have been brought about them when it comes down to redrawing their boundaries in the 2026 midterm elections. So, keep a close eye. Indiana, the first one of many, actually not the first one, but one of many to fall across here for the Republican Party. And only time will tell to see exactly how many more end up failing as well. But as it stands right now, Indiana, Kansas come to mind as states that were set to be so good for the GOP and just quite frankly were not. And we will see exactly the direct impact in roughly a year from now in the November 2026 midterm elections, where very obviously one seat will likely not make a difference whatsoever. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already.